what you feel the implications of the UK withdrawal from the Euratom Treaty for energy security is. And perhaps, I don't know who would like to start here, perhaps Angela Hepworth.
I'm happy to start. So I should say, first of all, I was very pleased when I saw that this committee would be looking specifically at the implications of Euratom in considering the implications for energy security. For EDF Energy, the government's decision to withdraw from the Euratom Treaty is something that's a significant concern. And that's because I'm sure you know that EDF Energy owns and operates the 8 existing nuclear power stations, and between them they provide around 20% of the UK's electricity. We're also in the process of building the first new nuclear power station in the generation at Hinkley Point, and we've got plans for follow-on nuclear projects. So, significant nuclear player in the UK. And we very much rely on the provisions in the Euratom Treaty to enable us to operate our existing power stations, and also in future for the construction and the operation of Hinkley Point. We rely on the ability that the Euratom provisions provide for us to import nuclear fuel, nuclear components, transfer information from the EU and also from key third countries into the UK. We also rely on our ability to draw on international skills and talent, both for our existing operations and for our new build programme. So any disruption in those arrangements could have implications for security of supply. For example, if there was some kind of component failure in one of our power stations and there was any delay in our ability to move components in to deal with that. And I can provide practical examples of that if that's helpful. So from our perspective, it's absolutely essential that the government puts in place replacement arrangements to replicate as far as possible the benefits that we've got at the moment through membership of the treaty. And if not, that could indeed have implications for security of supply.
I'd just like to add that not only is it 20% of our electricity needs that are produced from nuclear, but this is also low carbon energy generation, and this supports us in meeting the needs of the Climate Change Act. So we need to ensure that there isn't any problem in continuing to do that. So as our nuclear facilities come to their end of life, that they can be replaced. And Euratom has provided the opportunity for the movement of skilled individuals as well as parts and services in order to allow that to happen. In addition to that, as a nation, we've had the opportunity to input into the development of what happens within the Euratom Treaty, and we've had a very significant role as a main nuclear player in Europe to be able to do that. We've exported our skills and expertise to other countries, and we will lose that privilege as we leave Euratom if we don't make sure that we maintain very close connections.
If you had to produce a priority list of actions that the government needs to take as a result of leaving Euratom, what would they be and on what time frame? And I think, Angela, you've expressed some issues about materials, movement of materials, skills, and you've said that the UK needs to retain the benefits. Can you unpack that a little bit and tell us exactly what you think the UK government should do and how quickly?
Of course. So as I said, what the UK government really needs to do is put in place replacement arrangements to replicate what the Euratom Treaty provides for at the moment. And there are a number of different components for that, which are interrelated. So the first thing that's absolutely essential is we must have a domestic safeguards regime. At the moment, the UK complies with its international obligations in relation to non-proliferation through Euratom. So once we're no longer part of Euratom, we'll need to have our own domestic regime. I know Dr. Golshan will be able to say more about the details of that. So that's the first thing. We're going to need to negotiate a replacement agreement with Euratom, covering things like the ownership of nuclear material and also our future trading relations with Europe in relation to nuclear materials. We're going to need to negotiate nuclear cooperation agreements with key third countries. That's because at the moment Euratom has its own agreements in place with, for example, the US, Canada, Japan, Australia. Once we come out of Euratom, we no longer have the benefit of being part of those arrangements, so the UK will need to negotiate its own bilateral arrangements. The UK is going to have to negotiate arrangements for the mobility of workers. Now, of course, at the moment there are general provisions for free movement as part of our membership of the EU, but the Euratom Treaty also provides specific arrangements dealing with the free movement of people who are needed in the nuclear industry, including those who are needed for the construction of new nuclear power stations. So that's something that will need to be addressed. We're going to need to find ways of continuing to participate in European R&D programmes. We're world leaders in R&D at the moment. We need to keep up that engagement. The UK government will also need to address the export control regime, which is a key underpinning for our ability to move nuclear components. And then the final one on my list, I very much hope the UK government will be able to put in place arrangements for future cooperation on nuclear policy matters. So as you can see, that's quite a lot to get done in the time available, and there are some interdependencies between all of those. So I think what we'd really like to see from the government is a plan, a timetable for how those various elements are going to be delivered.
And are you suggesting that those 7 elements that you say are interconnected need to be in place at the time that we exit from Euratom?
Well,
if we were to have a gap?
If we go through the list, I mean, the ones that are absolutely critical on day one are a safeguards regime which is approved by the IAEA. It's imperative that we continue to comply with our international obligations, but also in terms of future agreements with Euratom and with third countries, those can't be put in place if we don't have an approved safeguards regime. So that's absolutely critical. Having nuclear cooperation agreements in place with third countries is also absolutely critical on day one. So, for example, for the US, if there is not a nuclear cooperation agreement in place between the US and another country, it is illegal for somebody in the US to export nuclear material or even share nuclear information with that country. So that's absolutely critical. It would be clearly highly beneficial for the UK to be able to negotiate an agreement with the EU covering the future relationship between the UK and the EU on nuclear cooperation matters and the ownership of nuclear material also. And then things like R&D, you might say they're not essential, but given what's at stake in terms of nuclear R&D within the UK, I would hope that would also be a very top priority.
Put it the other way around, supposing the UK government failed to meet the timetable, so on day one after Brexit in March 2019, you've said particularly the safeguards and the trading agreements have to be in place. If they fail to do that, what would the implication be for nuclear power generation in the UK?
Well, if we failed to have a safeguards regime in place, and if we failed to have nuclear cooperation agreements in place with key third countries, we wouldn't be able to share nuclear components, nuclear information with those countries. So, for example, as a practical example, if we had a component fail in one of our power stations and we needed to import a part from one of those countries, if we couldn't do it, then it might be the case that we'd end up with extended outages at our nuclear facilities, or we'd end up with plants out of operation. Now, I should say, and again, Dr. Gulshan will be able to say more about the details, but putting in place a safeguards regime is one of the elements of all of this, which is most directly in the control of the UK government. It has the ability to put that safeguards regime in place. It needs to get it approved by the IAEA, but that element of it is something that should be within the UK government's control. What we'd like to see from government, as I say, is a clear timetable and plan for delivering all of this. And if it appears to the UK government that they can't get all of this done in time, then absolutely they need to be thinking about whether there needs to be any kind of transitional arrangement. And I think we'd look for clarity on that sooner rather than later.
There isn't a shared plan B from the government at the moment about what will happen, and it's likely that what we'll need is time more than anything to actually finalise any arrangements if we don't meet the March 2019 deadline. But there is an element of what happens in other nations when they're agreeing the nuclear cooperation agreements, how long it takes for that to go through their various parliaments, their government regimes. And that's something that isn't in the control of the UK government, and we have to be prepared for what that may mean in terms of particularly the priority nuclear cooperation agreements.